Hello, this is Mrs. Koller. Welcome to your first podcast of the year. You'll be getting these periodically throughout the school year. This one is about the scientific method, and your related essential question, which should be popping up on the screen now, is how is science done? I'll start out with the first prompt on your note sheet, which is the characteristics of scientific investigation. And there are four main ones, although there are others. First characteristic of scientific investigations is taking observations. Observations is any kind of data that's gathered using the senses, and they can be qualitative, which describe the quality of something, like its color, its shape, etc. Or they can be quantitative, so that they're describing an amount or a measurement. They're describing a quantity or a number. So scientific observations can be either quantitative is preferred if it's available. Inquiry is the process of asking questions and seeking answers. And in science, inquiry is usually based on some sort of initial observation that you would make. And inquiry is conducted according to some specific rules that have been agreed on by all scientists. There's two main types of scientific inquiry. The first is discovery science, and that's based mostly on making observations, and oftentimes discovery science is accidental. Jane Goodall did this when she observed chimpanzees in their native environments. She didn't do any experiments on them, she just sat and watched. Penicillin was also discovered as a result of discovery science. Alexander Fleming came in one day and noticed there was mold growing on one of his bacterial cultures, and around the area where the mold was growing, no bacteria grew. So that led to figuring out what exactly it was that was inhibiting the bacterial growth. In hypothesis-based science, scientists use controlled experiments, and a controlled experiment tests only one variable at a time. And these investigations are usually very carefully conducted, and they're conducted according to a specific set of rules, which we're going to discuss in a minute. And this maybe should have been first, but one of the most important qualities of scientific investigation is skepticism. If you're skeptical, it means that you don't necessarily believe something just based on the results of one experiment. Other scientists need to review it. They need to repeat the experiment to see if it's valid. And what scientists believe to be true can change based on other experiments. So here we have skeptical cat. He questions the veracity of your claims. So you need to make sure that your claims are scientifically valid. And if scientists sense a flaw in your logic, they'll be able to point that out, and you'll have to go back and redo your experiments. So now we come to what we call the scientific method. Now, what you've probably had before is the scientific method almost like a recipe where you can just write down steps on a card. You ask a question, make a hypothesis, perform an experiment, collect data, draw conclusions. This is too simple. This is a middle school version of the scientific method. It may have worked to help getting you to understand it, but it's not really how science is done. The scientific method can go a lot of different directions, and a lot of steps are repeated. I'm not as concerned about you being able to put the steps in order. I want you to be able to use the scientific method and to be able to adjust it according to the needs for whatever we're studying at the time. So I want you to be able to do science, not just spit out the scientific method. So this model of the scientific method is a little bit better Because it's not completely linear, you have an observation, then a hypothesis, prediction, you test it, and then there's two possible outcomes for the test. If the data doesn't support your hypothesis, you reject it, you revise your hypothesis, and go back and repeat. If your hypothesis is supported, you do further tests, and you keep doing that around and around and around. And if many experiments come up with similar conclusions, then your hypothesis becomes a theory because it's been supported many, many times. That's one thing I want you to remember about a theory. A theory in science is not something that's tentative. In science, it's been supported by evidence over and over and over again. That doesn't mean you can't revise it later, but it does mean that it's what the majority of scientists consider to be true right now. In this model of the scientific method, you can actually see the scientists doing the steps. So one of the things I like about this model is up here in this area, you can see that after the hypothesis, you can either make observations or test the hypothesis. So this model shows the discovery science for making observations, and it shows hypothesis-based science for performing experiments. And if the observations don't support the hypothesis, you have to check if your experiment's faulty, do a new experiment, go back around. If it does support it, you draw your conclusions and communicate your results to other scientists. That's very important. Other scientists have to be able to replicate the results. If you don't communicate them, it doesn't become part of the official scientific body of knowledge. This model also, this is not linear at all. There's not even an actual starting point here, and that's one of the reasons that I really like this model is science can start from any step in the scientific method. You could be analyzing someone's results and realize that there's a flaw, and then from there go on to a different step. So there's lots of different paths to get from one step to another, and depending on how your experiment is going, you may have to skip a step, go back and repeat something, refine something, and try again. It's not linear. Now in this one, I realize that you can't read all of the steps, but I want you to see how many different areas there are on here. You have asking the questions, you have background research. Depending on what it is that you're studying, you may have to do some research before you can even form your hypothesis. You do your experiment, you analyze your results, there's a true contingency, there's a false contingency. The one thing I want to point out here is if it says hypothesis is true, I don't want you saying that in this class. You can say the data supports the hypothesis, but it hasn't been proven true. There's evidence to support it, but it hasn't been proven true. You can prove it false, but you can't prove it true. You can just support the hypothesis. You have to report your results, and these dotted lines here are different contingencies where you might have to go back and do something over again. And this is the last model I'm going to show you, but there's a couple things on it that I really like. One is that it shows you what to do if certain things fail, but I like if you test your hypothesis, if it passes or if the data supports the hypothesis, you go back and test it again and test it again and test it again. And once it's been passed many times, that hypothesis becomes a theory. Then other scientists will take that theory and they'll apply different experiments to it to test it. If it gets supported many times, the theory becomes a law. If it's not supported, you have to go back and look at either explain the observation or come up with a different hypothesis to try. So what I want you to be able to do is not just envision the scientific method as a step-by-step recipe. I want you to be able to look at the scientific method as something that's dynamic, something that changes, something that you modify to suit your needs. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this class. It's not going to be cookie cutter, do this, then do this, then do this. We're going to do experiments, and sometimes we'll have to make changes. Thanks for joining me for this first podcast of the school year. See you in class.